All right.
Cool. Yes.
All right. Great. Yeah, I guess I'll just give like a quick overview that like forecasters at the beginning of the season like unanimously called for an extremely active hurricane season, and in June all signs were pointing towards a very active season because there was record-breaking record ocean temperatures in the Atlantic. In the East Pacific, there was like cool, neutral ENSO state heading into La Nina. And we also had like record early activity. We had a June major hurricane that turned into a July Category 5 in the Caribbean. Um, and in August, the activity continued to a slightly lesser extent. And then I think us forecasters, we like to say in late August, there's a switch that flips, and usually we see a bunch of activity once the switch flips. I think this season the switch flipped off. And so I was wondering, could you explain what caused that?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost to the point where it's almost laughable to think, we had, as you mentioned, we had, all systems were go. We had every single climate feature that we look at was pointing towards bananas hurricane activity. So our group at CSU, we use a bunch of different tools to come up with our seasonal forecasts. So we use a bunch of statistical models, which is kind of the old classic way that Dr. Gray used to do his seasonal forecast, which is, okay, use what's happened up to now to forecast the future. And
Mhm.
those are all through the roof high. We have statistical dynamical models, which use like to the European Center model or the UK Met models forecast of the large scale environment. So we look at things like shears and water temperatures for the peak of the season. And all those are through the roof high. And even if you look at just the straight up dynamical models, so numerical models like the European Center, the UK Met Office will also forecast tropical cyclone activity, basically counting the vortices that spin up over the course of the season. They were all ridiculously high. Everybody bombs away.
Mhm. Yeah.
And then as you mentioned, we have barrel, and normally early season stuff doesn't really correlate that much with the rest of the season, but low latitude early season stuff is usually, so it's kind of it's a sufficient condition, but not a necessary one. There's plenty of big seasons that had nothing in June and July, but when you get a Cat 5, early July, breaking the old record by 2.5 weeks. We were breaking records that were set in 2005, 1933, which were like the two biggest years on record. So it seemed like this was, how we done this interview 2 months ago. It said this is the shoot, obviously you're never 100% confident, but we stressed this year, higher confidence than normal. I would have characterized it as almost like shooting fish in a barrel kind of hurricane season, not a hard one. And, I mean, the fact that, we've had one storm form since August 12th is ridiculous. And even now, you look at this tropical depression in the East Atlantic. Normally, a tropical depression coming off Africa, basically peak of the Atlantic hurricane season, be a surefire major hurricane, and this one
Yeah.
it
Is
can't
a
even get above
minimal,
tropical
maybe
depression.
moderate.
It's been
Yeah.
a tropical depression for 36 hours, and the shear's low, the waters are warm. It's been too stinking dry. And that's been the story of the Atlantic. The Atlantic looks like it's like the Arabian Sea out there. Like it's hot, but
Mhm.
you just can't sustain any convection. And that's just been, the bane of the Atlantic minus the Gulf of Mexico since mid-August. It's just been really, really dry. And that
Yeah.
has just really knocked stuff down. And that's kind of weird because normally, so especially through late August, the shear was super low. And normally when the shear is low, you don't usually the shear, when you get a lot of westerly shear, it comes with dry air from the mid latitudes. Like you get these tropical upper tropospheric troughs that dig in, bring in all this dry air, all this westerly shear. But we didn't have that in August. We had very low shear throughout August. It was the most easterly shear on record across the main development region, which normally means like not much. So it was very low shear. So it was one of those things where it was like, if you look at the shear and you look at the water temperatures, it should have been bombs away, and yet we still had nothing. And we look at moisture, and if you look historically and use mid-level moisture as a predictor, it's not that great. And maybe that's just because the reanalysis products don't do a great job of measuring it back
Mhm.
historically. But this season, it's just too dry. I mean, and you see the discussions even with this tropical depression. They've been great. They're all talking about like the shear's
Yeah.
low, the waters are warm, but it's having trouble sustaining deep convection. You see it. It's just like it's puffing, but there's arc clouds everywhere. It's just
Yeah.
too dry.
It's getting to a point.
So it's just, I think this storm is really kind of summarizing the season. And then of course you go the other direction. You look at Francine, which was popping off -80, -90 degrees Celsius cloud tops when it got into the Bay of Campeche, which is like the exact opposite. That's some of like the deepest convection I've ever seen in the Atlantic. So it's just been a very, very weird season. Starting off so busy. And even though we had nothing, I think today's the first day we're actually going below normal for ACE for the year, just because Beryl put us so far ahead. But we've had nothing, and maybe this thing will go in the East Atlantic, but after that, there's not much for about 10 days. After that, the models are starting to get really enthusiastic. Beyond 10 days, it's by far the strongest signal I've seen consistently between the GEFs and the EPS ensembles. But I say nothing at this point. My confidence in forecasting right now is extremely low. I don't blame you. So I looked at the so we do our seasonal forecast. We forecast numbers of storms, but we also calculate statistically like probabilities of exceedance. So if you forecast say you forecast 12 hurricanes, historically, if you use the error of the forecasts, what are the odds that we get more than 7 or something like that? And so I looked at our accumulated cyclone energy forecast, and not saying we're getting no ACE after today, which I'm sure we will get plenty because it's the peak of the season, and the subseasonal stuff, as I'm sure we'll talk about, is going to get more conducive here in the next couple of weeks. But if we got no more activity, our model said there was a 1 in 60,000 chance of having this level of storm activity. So
so this is certainly outside the range of what you
correct. Well outside the range. Just because when you forecast basically like almost twice a normal season, the odds of getting half a normal season should be quite low. So and again, if we end up getting, if basically we double the ACE between now and the end of the season, which is fairly common, then it becomes like a 1 in 100 shot, which again, not great, but then you're talking at least something that's more in the realm of possibility. I mean, if you have a busy late season, then it becomes more like a 1 in 20, 1 in 30, and that's well within the realm of what you expect historically. Is you're going to have these years where things kind of quote unquote underachieve. But I think it's really been a different things, I think, that have jacked stuff up at different times since the middle of August. I don't think it's like this is the one answer, this is what's been doing it the whole time.
Okay.
And I don't know, I mean, we can just keep talking. I can keep going. Okay, so basically, mid to late August, we just had no tropical waves. Like, they all came off of Africa too far north, which is weird too, because normally for a busy hurricane season, you look at the classic Bill Gray stuff, the strong West African monsoon is associated with the busy hurricane season. And usually you want that monsoon trough shifted a bit north. But this year it was like everything was too far north. So the waves we're coming off Africa and off of like Western Sahara. We had several in a row. So it was interesting. I was looking back today. If you look at the TAF-B, like their surface analyses, and you looked at, say, in June, they would have like 5 tropical waves analyzed across the Atlantic. You look at late August and there were 2. Like we just didn't have the seeds, and the waves that were there had no convection. So I mean, you look late August, it was clear. Like there were like no clouds in the tropical Atlantic. So and part of it was we just didn't have any seeds. So if you don't have any waves, kind of moistening the environment. But since then, we've had plenty of waves coming off at low latitudes. The NHC's had 5 or 6 different invests, at certain points, they were looking at different stuff. But you look at right now, they pulled off one of them, but this morning yesterday we had the tropical depression, and then we had 2 waves in the central Atlantic at peak season. Normally you would expect, okay, one of those, if not 2, are probably going to be major hurricanes. You're plunking waves, deep tropics, peak of the season, and nothing. And maybe this thing in the East Atlantic may go once it gets a little further along. There's a lot of model uncertainty, or it may just die, which I'm guessing, given the way the season's been going.
Maybe it won't even make it.
Maybe it'll never get named. That would be perfectly fitting. But it's the models have been really inconsistent, and some of that is, I think, just the signals. Everything's just kind of marginal, and I think that's why stuff is not. You don't have these smoking gun signals that you got, say, for example, mid-August last year. There was a lot of discussion because we had gone since dawn. We got since like early July with no storms, and everyone mid-August like, oh, the season's a dud. But you could see the long-range ensembles were just lit up like a Christmas tree. Like, no.
Yeah, the switch hadn't flipped yet.
Yeah, the switch hadn't flipped. So Dr. Gray, my mentor, used to ring a bell every year on August 20th. And so we still ring the bell in his memory, signaling that the climatological, like, big run up to the season. And it was like August 20th, I think we had 2 storms form. And we had, from August 20th to September 28th, we had 13 storms form in 39 days, which was insane. Like, it was the most on record during those two dates. So, it went berserk. Whereas this year, we rang the bell August 20th, and we've had one storm, one storm. And so, it was, it was a decent storm. I mean, it made a category 2 and, caused some damage. So it wasn't like it was a nothing storm, but
but in middle of September peak season, you would expect more than a Gulf of Mexico, like, quick category 2.
Correct. Yeah. And I think part of it really kind of highlights the season is NHC started tracking the easterly wave, or it was in the tropical weather outlook on August 26th.
Mm-hmm.
So that thing was in August 26th, and when did it finally form? Like the 9th, right? Yeah. September 9th when it got named, I think. So, I mean, it just goes to show you, like, it took so dang long for the thing to form. And eventually it did. But, normally peak season stuff, and you get stuff that just spins up randomly. Like, we've had no higher latitude storms, which is really weird. Normally you get some of those. Even in junk years, I mean, like, it's been just weird that we haven't had just junk. Like, usually when the tropics are garbage, you get stuff at higher latitudes, and we can't even get one of those. Maybe we'll get something off the Carolina coast, but even that's looking kind of questionable. So it's very strange to not get anything, So it's been really weird, and again, this season's been odd. The Atlantic is still boiling hot. We're trending towards La Nina. We should have a very strong Caribbean gyre spinning stuff up late season. The MJO is going to become a lot more favorable once we get into late September, early October. This time, the waves won't be coming off super far north because it's later in the season, so the waves come off at lower latitudes. The models are finally like, hey, we're going to get probably 2 or 3 legit waves coming off starting in about 10 days. So maybe we'll get a late wave train, kind of like we saw in 98, where we had 4 hurricanes at the same time last week in September. But at this point, I don't say anything. Like, there's nothing. Nothing's close enough that I have any confidence. Because if we had talked even 2 days ago, I would say this tropical depression, ECWF was like, it's going to be strong and just park itself in the central Atlantic for a week. So I would have told you, okay, we're going to get like a long-lived major hurricane out of this. It's going to be a lot of ace, and it's one storm, but it's going to bump the numbers up quite a bit. Whereas now it's like, maybe.
No, you're not sure. Yeah,
maybe it won't even it'll probably get named. Just given the environment tomorrow looks better than today, but whether it becomes a hurricane is, I don't know, maybe give it like a 30% chance at this point. So it's been very interesting.
Yeah. There's a lot of points that you brought up that I wanted to touch on. I think one thing that in the discussion that I think I like in the discussion that you put on the Colorado page that I think really caught my interest was on the African monsoon and how the waves are coming off further north than normal. And I think that ties into how, like, the main development region, the part of the Atlantic that is between the Caribbean and the coast of Africa, where storms normally form, that's been so dry this year. And part of that's because these waves coming off further north are bringing the dry air down into the main development region. So I haven't heard very much conversation, like, in the research about the position of the monsoon trough in regards to seasonal or subseasonal forecasting. This seems like a new topic to me. So I guess my question to you is, do you know of any research on this subject, or is this or is there any way that, or any connection that we have that links this monsoon position to some, like, the MJO or other subseasonal factors?
Yeah, I mean, normally kind of, there hasn't been a ton like, oh, it's the monsoon trough position, but in general, kind of like if you go back to the stuff that Chris Lanty and Bill Gray did, they would say normally a northward shifted monsoon trough is good for hurricanes. It tends to pull them up a little further north, so they kind of go into that max, basically kind of like the meat of the main development region, because you want stuff coming off at 15, 16 degrees north or so. Dr. Gray used to always say Dakar, Senegal, when they get rain, that's the thing. And so it's weird because, again, it hasn't continued that high latitude. Like, more recently, the waves have been coming off. As, again, you see, there's a whole lot of, a week ago, there was like all this like rotating blobs of weak vorticity in the Atlantic. There were plenty of waves. It just was, you couldn't get anything to consolidate. And for a while, nothing was moving, which is a problem too. If the storms don't move, they don't form either. So it's been, but I I don't think there's really been a lot to, like what happens when waves go off super far north. And again, that happens. You'll get waves when you get a low pressure right off the west coast of Africa. You'll get stuff like, oh gosh, the one from, I think it was, Ermine in 2022, where it'll go like straight north. It'll come right off Africa, go straight north. And there's even a chance of that in like a week. The GFS has a storm basically like coming off Africa and then almost like retrograding back, like coming off the coast and then going northeast, like back into Africa. So who knows? I mean, that would be weird. And I don't think I've necessarily seen the storm go northeast, but because the trades are going to be so weak, I guess it could happen. But yeah, I haven't really seen a lot. And so kind of one of the many things we want to look at with kind of what we're trying to figure out about the season is one of the things that we did with our paper on last year was we ran some simulations kind of using the sea surface temperature boundary conditions and said, with the sea surface temperatures, can we kind of get the way the winds responded? Because to me, it's like, and the answer with last year was pretty well. We could do it from the sea surface temperatures. Obviously, you have a lot of other stuff that sea surface temperatures aren't going to get you, like your subseasonal variability. Just having the sea surface temperatures doesn't get you that perfectly. But if you average over, say, 3 months, it should kind of get you that. So what we want to see is if we force the Atlantic, or if we basically say keep sea surface temperatures the same everywhere around the globe, except for the Atlantic, just force the Atlantic with the observed sea surface temperatures, will that basically shift the kind of monsoon trough further north, just looking at the low level winds? And kind of my working hypothesis is that because the North Atlantic was extremely warm and the equatorial Atlantic was a little cool, not this Atlantic Niña that everyone was talking about, but it was a little bit cooler than normal, that because it's cool at the kind of just south of the equator and warm north of the equator, that gets more cross equatorial flow. It pushes that monsoon trough further north.
Okay.
So that's.
So you think that, just to like summarize, you can correct me if my interpretation is wrong, but so like because of the SSTs in the Atlantic, that forces the monsoon north. And so we would expect that this position of the monsoon too far north is probably more of a seasonal influence if it's tied to the SSTs.
Correct. Yeah. And so, but again, if it's interesting because if you look at the SSTs now versus 2 weeks from now, the equatorial Atlantic anomalies have warmed a lot. And we've seen that come back south. So it's hard to say, I always look at everything from like a sea surface temperature perspective, but there's a lot of weather that goes into this too. And it may just be synoptic weather patterns that just set up. And, some of this dry air may also be coming further north. Like there's been a very persistent block over Canada, low pressure over say, basically like a very positive NAO. And I don't think that's played as much of a role because it seems like the dry air's not coming from that far away. It's more local from the subtropics. But one thing we want to try to do is to even do some like moisture diagnostics to see how much is coming from where, because hopefully we can kind of quantify some of that stuff. So it's not just me like spitballing, which is what I'm doing right now. So so basically, like I said, we have a pretty big team that's kind of looking at stuff now from a whole bunch of different ways to try to kind of really figure stuff out. Because to me, number one, we got to figure out what went wrong. And then two, obviously my bazillion-dollar question is, can we forecast it? Because
that was one of the questions I was going to ask you.
That would be nice, because obviously we didn't see it coming. Noah didn't see it coming. Nobody saw it coming. So the fact that numerical models didn't see it coming either doesn't give me a lot of confidence. The first hints at something maybe kind of going amok was the European Center weekly tropical cyclone forecast starting around early August. We're highlighting below normal the end of August, despite low shear. And I remember texting one of my friends and being like, that's crazy. There's no way. Like, hot Atlantic, favorable MJO phases, low shear, it's going to go. But the model was right. Now, granted, if you look at a week 3 European Center tropical cyclone forecast, it doesn't always work great. It's not super skillful. So, but what would be interesting to do too is to try to kind of maybe look at some of their diagnostics and see what the models saw to basically kind of tell us that. Because it was about mid-August where we had our Nesto, but, it was like there's nothing behind it. Like there was no signs of and it wasn't like the signals were weak. The ensembles it was like a white map. Like there was zero anything. Like there was nothing rotating in the tropical Atlantic. So it was like, it wasn't just, there's not much in the operational runs. Like the ensembles had zero. Now there's stuff spinning up in the ensemble. So there's chances, whereas then there was zero. So that was really weird to see. And I've seen stuff like that before, but usually around mid-August, whatever, it kind of like figures out that, okay, the Atlantic's getting busy. We should turn on some storms. But it just kept kind of, and there's been stuff that's kind of promised tantalizingly, but we just haven't had much consistent signal because, again, the conditions are marginal, and frankly, we haven't had much in the way of storms. And even Francine ended up kind of a little bit overachieving, given the models a few days before really weren't that keen on that either. It just kind of tracked a little more northeast of what the models were predicting, so it ended up being over the Gulf longer, and had a somewhat favorable interaction with that trough. So even though it had a ton of shear, was able to intensify. And we're starting to actually see an eye pop out right before it came on land. So I think it went on land when it did, because it may have been major had it been over water another 6 hours.
Yeah, but like on the other hand, like if you could easily see a scenario where Francine like plowed into Mexico and you didn't even have a hurricane out of that. So
correct, yeah.
like,
well, the thing was, if you looked, so when NHC started putting up tropical weather outlooks, there was some time in late August where the models were basically like, the ensembles were pretty robust at saying this is going to be it's going to intensify near the islands, go tear through the Caribbean, then come up into the Gulf, maybe like high end, major hurricane for several days. And so going into Labor Day, I was like, well, we'll see. Like, I was thinking, if we get nothing through Labor Day, I need to write something up, because there's been a ton of media and we need to write something down. Normally we don't do a report middle of the season, but I was like, well, if we get a big hurricane in the Caribbean, I'm not going to bother, because the attention will go from the quiet to what the heck's going on if there's a Cat 4 or 5 tracking through the Caribbean at peak season. But then to get to Labor Day, I'm like, there's still nothing. So we got to write something up, and so we did a ton of interviews last week on it about the season. Even into this week, because it was like the peak of the season and we hadn't had anything. And of course, now that we had Francine and the landfall, that kind of distracts the media, because we just had a landfalling hurricane and there was some damage. So they start thinking about that. But again, I honestly don't know the next couple weeks if there's not much in the way of storms. I don't know what are you going to do? Write the same story again? Like, hey, it's still quiet. So
yeah,
I suspect there won't be a much more media for a little bit, just because we just had a landfall, and we already basically said the season has not performed the way that was forecast. But again,
the story's already been broke.
I do think as we get later in September, stuff's going to pop. Now, does it do anything? Does it actually track across the Atlantic? Does it recurve east? Who knows? Yeah. But there's definitely, I'm seeing right now some of the strongest signals, consistent signals I've seen at day 11 to 15 in a while. Like, both the EPS and the GEFs, both ensembles are very, very aggressive, and it matches up pretty well with the subseasonal. Like, we should be getting into enhancing convection over the Western Hemisphere, more over Africa, which should wake up the monsoon again, but also start to kind of get these things rolling. So maybe we'll have a late season flurry and we'll end up getting 3 or 4 major. I mean, we've seen some crazy stuff. It could be like
a 2020 kind of year where all of a sudden there were these, like, it was 4 major hurricanes in October and November. And
we actually had 5. It was nuts.
5, yeah.
Yeah. And so prior to that, the record was 2 in October, November. We had 2 major hurricane formations in October, November. In 2020, we had 5. So, like September 10th, we were sitting at 1 major hurricane in the Atlantic in 2020. So, same as what we're at now. Now, obviously 2020 didn't lack for storms, but I remember thinking at the end of September, people think it was busy because we had 23 storms by the end of September, but we'd only had 2 major hurricanes. But then we ended up getting 7 because we had forecast 6. And I'm like, there's no way, maybe we'll get to 4. That's not too bad. And then we ended up getting.
And then you actually underpredicted it.
We underpredicted. So, I hesitate to say the season's, 100% a dud, because, you get some late season storm in the Caribbean that tears through stuff and causes a ton of damage. No one's going to think it's a dud. 2022, our forecast wasn't that great, but we had Ian. So, end of the season, no one was saying the season's a dud because we had a $100 billion hurricane hit Florida. So, who knows? But again, it's been weird how long this has lasted. And again, I think, had we had a couple of high latitude weak storms and a hurricane somewhere, it probably wouldn't have gotten the attention, but because we had 0, that's what got everyone's attention. I mean, you're just running. It's like going 2 for 18 versus 0 for 20. Like, people notice more when you get 0 hits than when you get, an occasional hit, but are in a slump anyway. So I think the massive slump that the Atlantic went into was certainly caught everybody by surprise. And obviously, had people been forecasting an average season, probably, would have been like, okay, whatever. But because everyone was going so aggressive and we had Beryl and the hype train was through the roof in mid-July, everybody just kind of assumed it was going to be, a 2005. And I was that was the reason 2005 was an analog. I didn't have 2013 in my analog list. So
I was just gonna bring up 2013 because that was, I suppose, the last time that there was a significant over forecast. I guess this is the hallmark of a busted forecast, is 2013, where there was also early season main development region activity, and signals looked like it was going to be active, and then 2013, there were 2 hurricanes and no
Yeah.
major hurricanes. So are there any similarities that you're seeing between this year and 2013, or is this an
See,
entirely new, different type of?
and that, yeah, that's the thing. Because if you look at 2013, and we did a paper after 2018, which was kind of the opposite. So 2018, most groups came in low, and the season ended up somewhat above normal. And it was kind of an overachieving season. You look at the Atlantic that year, the waters were cold. We had a developing El Nino. Things were kind of meh. But we had a favorable MJO at like the peak of the season. We got several major hurricanes. Then we had a couple major hurricanes in, and then we have Michael late that really kind of boosted the numbers up. And so if you look at 2013 and 2018, they were kind of in the middle if you plotted things like shear. And so you would expect, okay, so they kind of over and underachieved respectively, but they weren't. 2013 was kind of marginal. Like you look at the sea surface temperatures, they weren't, it wasn't this year where things are still, it wasn't like, so normally when things go badly for the forecast, it's because things don't play out the way we expect. Either you get an El Nino, you didn't expect one, but this year it's like, we just didn't have, the waters are warm. The La Nina is kind of trending the way that we thought. Through August and early September, the shear was extremely low. So all the stuff that we expected to be there was there. The African monsoon was through the roof busy. So all that stuff in general was there through early September. Now, more recently, we've had subseasonal variability that's been not conducive, and it's moving at a snail's pace. It's like giving us like the junk MJO for like 3 weeks at the peak of the season. So that's kind of what I consider more like bad luck. Had the monsoon trough been in a better position during late August, we would have had a couple of storms, but because we didn't get it then when the system finally came off, we finally got the trough digging into the central Atlantic, causing the increase in shear right as we got the waves. So even Francine gone into the Caribbean 2 days earlier, the trough wouldn't have been there. The shear would have been much lower, probably would have been a hurricane through the Caribbean. But because the trough was there, it was sheared the whole way through the Caribbean and finally managed to go in the Gulf. So it's one of those things where, like, when you look at a seasonal forecast, it's like you can always have these kinds of wild cards. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why these seasonal forecasts, even not like this year, but even in a year where you do generally okay, there are things like if you get suppressed phase of the MJO at peak of the season, which you can't really time a month in advance. And especially this one, like it's moving slow. It's like phase 5 for a week, phase 6 for a week. Like it's just taking its sweet time. And then it's going to like wrap around really fast. So it's been the subseasonal stuff, I think, also conspiring to kind of, torque the season. So again, we'll see if maybe getting more conducive subseasonal as we get into late September, maybe the Atlantic will wake up, because it's still hot out there. Like the waters haven't cooled any. They're still very warm. The upper levels are starting to cool. They usually cool this time of year, so the stability issues should mitigate a bit. But we'll see.
Yeah. Yeah. So I realized that I didn't realize that the meeting was timed, so we only have like 9-ish minutes left.
Oh, sorry.
I didn't know that it was going to cut me off. So yeah, so I guess I do want to bring up climate change, because of a few of the things in the discussion, particularly like the upper tropospheric temperatures. I know there's been lots of links in discussion on whether we know that climate change is increasing sea surface temperatures, but if it's also increasing upper level tropospheric temperatures, that sort of mitigates and means that convection is about average. And I was also kind of curious, like if we have SST patterns that shift the monsoon so far north that waves don't form, is it plausible that climate change may actually have been somewhat responsible for this lack of activity?
Yeah, so I mean, I think really, this year, I think one of the reasons why the upper troposphere is so warm is because of the El Nino. So when we have an El Nino, after the El Nino, the upper levels of the atmosphere warm quite a bit. So the year after an El Nino, so if you look last year versus this year, it's much warmer higher up. And that's pretty normal for, a year going into an El Nino versus the year during and after the El Nino. That lag warming takes a little while, or it stays around for a while, and then it'll cool as we transition more towards this La Nina. And so if you look historically at upper level temperatures, if you just do like a difference of upper level temperatures minus surface temperatures, they don't really matter. Like the correlation is pretty low. And if anything, it's even a little positive, because when your surface temperatures are warm, your upper level temperatures also tend to be warm. And if you have a warm Atlantic, that's generally considered good for hurricanes. But this year they're a lot warmer, so there may be kind of a threshold that's been reached this year, and probably most of that's El Nino. Maybe in the future it will be a more of a climate changey kind of thing, where in the future that maybe that will be kind of a something that happens longer term. I haven't seen a lot to kind of say, because I think some of, again, what kind of pushed the monsoon trough so far north was the North Atlantic being cool, but the equatorial Atlantic being, or sorry, the North Atlantic being warm, the equatorial Atlantic being cool. But I haven't seen much kind of saying that's a more common pattern we'll expect to see in the future. So I think that's a little bit hard to say, but certainly, again, you look at the past, and we've seen some really weird things, and there's years with our models just don't do as well. And again, it's hard to say if we end up the year having a busy late season and we end up with 9 hurricanes and 4 major hurricanes. Yeah, it'll be an over forecast, but not that notable. Whereas if if we end up the season with 6 hurricanes and 1 major hurricane or something like that, then that's a huge thing. So will it be 20? I mean, is it 2013? I mean, no, because we already had a Category 5 hurricane, so it's not 2013.
Yeah, we've already had some bad storms.
It's weird. It's weird that way because in a way, like we've already had 3 hurricanes hit the U.S., which is a decent number. That's more than an average season already. So from a landfall perspective, we're 6 for 6. Every storm that's formed, every storm that's been named is hit somewhere. But from it's just been, like I said, it's been a weird year where we can't get anything to form right off of Africa, which is odd, just given how warm it is off of Africa. And again, you showed me the African monsoon and said it was going to be, raining like crazy. That's normally good for hurricanes because a more vigorous monsoon means your easterly waves are stronger. But I think some of it may also be because the trades in the Atlantic, again, normally you want the trades weak for a busy season, but they've been so weak that if you look last week, like you read the tropical weather outlook at NHC, be like, we're monitoring this area. Right now it's drifting. Like it was just drifting, like nothing's moving. And so you don't want things to be screaming across, but you don't want storms not moving at all either. So it's like, for a while, it seemed like the Atlantic was almost too hot. Like it was like the waters were too warm. The monsoon trough was too far north. The monsoon was too strong. Like the stuff that normally the conditions that you want were there, but like you cranked them up too high. But if you look at papers that have been published talking about, La Niñas and really positive meridional modes, which is effectively what we have, most of those show that those become really hyperactive seasons. So there hasn't really been any work that I've seen that says like you can almost turn the thermostat up too much to actually that'll start to cause the hurricanes to come down. But again, it's hard because the monsoon trough was too far north for a couple of weeks, but had the MJO not had been weak, or the MJO had timed its phases differently, and we were in phase 1 and 2 now, we probably have 2 or 3 hurricanes going on. But because it's like one thing.
So some of it's just noise.
Yeah, and so that's part of it too. Is it's like one of the things that you struggle with is obviously this forecast isn't going to verify gray. Like it's just not. It's too late. But how much do you change when one year doesn't behave the way you expect? Like after 2013, we redeveloped our models, and instead of forecasting above normal, now the models forecast near normal. So again, not great, but if you forecast 6 hurricanes and get 2, that's not great, but that's not horrible. But if you forecast 9 and get 2, that's really bad. So again, at the end of the season, if we're sitting at 9 hurricanes, which we very well could, and you forecast 11 or 12, that's not bad. I mean, our error historically is plus or minus 2. So if it's minus 3 for one season, I'm not going to be, that's not something to completely jettison all the forecasts over. But, maybe this thing doesn't go. The tropical depression never gets hurricane. None of these other things form, and we're at 5. I mean, we're going to get more hurricanes. There's no way we end the season at 4, but maybe we end the season at 6, or in 1 major or something like that. Then you want to take a harder look. But I think really the key is we don't really know what caused everything. So we got to better be able to understand it and then better be able to model it, because I'm not convinced we can say anything in April or June, but you would hope in August you could see some of this stuff coming. So that's kind of what I'm hoping for. And
it was unusual that like even in August where like we didn't have a clear idea of what the season was going to be.
Correct. Yeah. So. Yeah. And again, had things like the European Center weeks 3, weeks 4 seasonal, TC forecast been, obviously that's extremely hard. Like I'm not going to dump on them because nobody can do, like, that's really, really hard. But had, for some reason, if those were always really good and you saw that, you'd be like, holy cow, this is something we want to be paying attention to. But, I've certainly seen times where the European Center's like, we're getting no storms. I mean, you get a ton, or times where like bombs away and you get nothing. So it's especially at the longer lead times, week 1 and 2, they're not bad. So
week 1 and 2 is where where the global models still have like some skill.
Correct. Yeah.
All right. So I think we've only got like 2-ish minutes. I guess real quick, do you expect like the rest of the season to be above average, and how confident are you in that forecast?
Well, right now forecasting not super confident. I would say next week or so, if this tropical depression doesn't go, that's really our best shot at a hurricane till probably about the 23rd, 24th. Looks like when stuff's going to start to really potentially pick up. There's signs in both the ensembles of vigorous stuff coming off of Africa. Even the operational GFS, which has had nothing at long range, has occasionally been spinning up a hurricane at that long range. So that, I think, is probably the last week in September is when stuff should pick up. Again, this tropical depression, if it can survive the next few days, could potentially become a hurricane, even a major hurricane as it recurves into the westerlies. But it's got to survive the next few days. The environment doesn't look horrible, but the global models hate it, other than the European Center. So we'll see. We'll see if it can make it through. So there is certainly uncertainty there, but I think after that, there's really nothing. Maybe a weak thing off the Carolina coast, but then once you get to last week in September, that's when I think things may get quite a bit more interesting with stuff trying to fire in the Caribbean as well as off the coast of Africa.
Okay, so maybe a busy end of September and October.
Correct.
And finally, we have a minute. What do you think we've learned this season, and how will you apply that to future forecasts?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we've learned a lot. Obviously, we've learned that even when you have everything pointing one direction and everything is screaming busy, that, it doesn't always pan out that way. So, certainly I think gives people a dose of humility. I mean, certainly we've had some busts, but I think that is one thing. And also, just highlights that, there's a lot. We try to take in a ton of factors when we look at this, and we try to look at it from a bunch of different ways, but there's obviously some ways that we haven't looked at a season before that, again, we need to understand exactly what kind of quote unquote broke the season. And then can we forecast that? And that's what we're going to be looking at. And obviously, again, a lot of it is how much longer this continues and what we end up with at the end of the season. Because again, if we end up with an above normal season, that's one thing. But if we end up with a near normal or even slightly below normal, that's a whole nother ball game. So we shall see what transpires in the second half of hurricane season.